So when we come to the Gospels, there are things about Jesus. There are numerous things that we can verify about him. Scholars disagree on a lot of things, but there's widespread agreement that Mark and John are independent of one another.
Right.
So you've got that. Mark, the majority of today's New Testament scholars do think that Mark's primary source was recollections of what Peter had told him. So we have Mark rooted in eyewitness testimony. When it comes to the Gospel of John, most contemporary New Testament scholars do not think that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote it. I do. I'm in the minority, but most do not. However, the majority of New Testament scholars do think that the author of John's Gospel used one of Jesus' disciples as his primary source for that Gospel. And so again, if John the son of Zebedee did not write it, it's still rooted in eyewitness testimony. And we could talk about Matthew and Luke too, but just that, you've got multiple independent sources rooted in eyewitness testimony. Mark is written between 20 and 40 years after Jesus, which is quite early by ancient standards. You've got John that's written probably around 60 to 65 years after Jesus. Still pretty good. I mean, we're 75 years removed from World War II, and we're still interviewing World War II vets. No problem. They were there. They're still alive. We can talk with them. John's written 60 to 65 years later and rooted in eyewitness testimony. You've got some things from unsympathetic sources like Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, Bar Serapion that talk about his death and some other things. So there are numerous things that we can know about Jesus through these kind of sources and using historical method.
And then fourthly, you said that there were some things that may have been wrong. What do you mean by that?
Well, I've done some work with Plutarch over the years. Plutarch is considered the greatest historian in antiquity, greatest biographer in antiquity, I'm sorry. And, there are a lot of differences in the way Plutarch tells the same account in his different biographies. Like Caesar's assassination is told in 4 different biographies. The Catilinarian conspiracy, I think, is told in 7 of his different biographies. And there are differences involved. And, you can compare what Plutarch says with what other ancient historians say. And there are occasions when it appears that Plutarch has some things wrong. We can't prove that they're wrong. There might be some sort of a compositional device behind that, a reason he changed it. Maybe some of the other sources are all wrong. Maybe there's something. History can be a lot more complicated. There's a lot more to history than a lot of times we realize what's going on behind the events. Things that could seem contradictory really aren't after all. So I'm hesitant to say when it comes to the Gospels that we know that there are for certain errors in them. But I think we can say that there are, in my opinion, when we take compositional devices into account.
What do you mean by compositional devices?
Like sometimes they would compress and narrate events as though they occurred over a shorter period of time, or they would displace events from a certain chronological context and transplant it to another. For example, Jesus cleansing the temple occurred on Monday, but Matthew backs it up to Sunday and conflates it with the first temple visit of Jesus. So Mark says he went in on Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry. He goes in and he just looks around and he leaves. And then Monday he comes back and he cleanses the temple. But Matthew says Palm Sunday he goes in, walks into the temple and cleanses it. So he conflates those two events. He transplants the temple cleansing to Sunday. And the same thing with the fig tree. Mark has it in 2 stages. He curses the tree on Monday. He sees it withered on Tuesday. In Matthew, he curses it on Monday and immediately it withers and dies. So that's what I would call a compositional device.
Got you. So these apparent these apparent errors or things that contradict each other may just be that apparent. There might be other reasons for them. Yeah,
it's the same kind of stuff you and I and every one of us. Almost every one of us do in our everyday, ordinary conversations. We don't think anything of it. We don't consider it to be an error. So once you eliminate what, those things like that are probably due to compositional devices, or even some things that can be harmonized, although I don't like to press harmonization. I I think there might be just a handful,
Okay.
4 or 5 differences in the Gospels that are reasonable candidates for errors. Things such as
what would be one?
How Judas died.
Yes.
That would be one. That's a very difficult one. That's probably the most difficult one, along with the infancy narratives.
Tell us why, for those who aren't aware, the two descriptions of how Judas died and why it's difficult to reconcile them.
Well, Matthew says that Judas hanged himself, but Acts says that he fell headlong and his gut burst open. So that doesn't seem to be compatible. Now, some have tried to say, well, he hung himself, the rope broke or the branch broke, and he fell. And hey, that's possible. But
fair enough.
But that really sounds like a strained attempt, because if the rope breaks, are you going to fall headlong?
Yeah.
It was right over a kind of a cliff, and the rope broke, and he hit land first with his butt, and it caused him to fall forward and tumbled down the hill. That's possible. Hey, that is possible.
Right. It seems rather ad hoc.
It does.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say it didn't happen, because strange things do happen, and that may be the case.
Yeah.
But it may be the case that it's an error.
But either way, these discrepancies or apparent discrepancies are few and don't affect the main narrative of what the Gospels are trying to share.
That's exactly right. There are very few. Like I said, there might be just a handful of them like that. Maybe not even a full handful. And you're right. They're all in the peripheral details. They don't change the essential story.
And then I suppose another way to figure out whether or not a particular set of documents are reliable is, obviously these things are copied and sent around to different parts of the world. If you were to go back and gather some of the original copies of the Gospels or fragments of the Gospels over the first, say, 500 years, and then compare and contrast them with each other, this should show whether or not there had been any serious embellishments or changes in the Gospels. Yeah.
Yeah.
And do we know anything about that? Yeah.
Well, I would suspect, Matt, based on what we have, I don't think that there are, we can get back to a text. Even Bart Ehrman would, the skeptical New Testament scholar, would say that we can get back to a text which is very, very, pure to what the original said. Not 100%.
How do you know that? How can you figure that out?
Well, because we've got so many manuscripts.
Gotcha.
We've got over 5,000. We probably got about 5,500 unique, manuscripts. Okay, some the official count right now is 5,843, I think. But Dan Wallace has said a lot of those have been counted twice by accident. So there's probably about 5,500 Greek manuscripts that are quite early. Okay, not all of them are early, I should say, but maybe 100. Let's see. I don't know. I don't want to comment on that right now, but a lot. But what you would do is you can look a lot, and you can see where a lot of the corruptions of the manuscripts occurred. And you can get back using the principles of textual criticism to get back to what the original text probably said. And there are some places in the New Testament where we just aren't certain. A lot of them are really minor, like 1 John 1:4, I think it is, where it says, we write these things so that our joy may be full. Or is it we are writing these things so that your joy may be full? And we have no idea which one the original said, but it really doesn't matter. But I don't think there's any, New Testament scholar who works in the field of textual criticism who would say the text that we have today doesn't bear a very close resemblance to what was originally written.
Hey, if you enjoyed that clip, you will absolutely love the full interview, so click right there to enjoy the whole thing. Also, a big thanks to these groups who made that interview possible. Learn more in the show notes below about these guys. They're absolutely incredible, and honored to have them as sponsors. Oh, and also, if you haven't subscribed yet, click subscribe and then that bell button. That way YouTube will be forced to let you know when we put out more content.